So there is a new situation, and this is, can we work with other partners in a collective, in a group? That is the new thing. My sense is this could be the beginning, and tomorrow we could have a separate minilateral, say India, Israel, and Egypt, or India, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. So the multiple possibilities open up in this part of the world. So I think we're really onto something new here in Indian foreign policy.
So, in this week's Raja Mandala, it's sort of prophetic. About 2 months ago, I think in August, you'd written a piece, which you, in one of your columns, in another column, about an Egyptian scholar who'd said the Indo-Abrahamic Accords, when certain countries in the Middle East and Israel had a sort of détente, and there was and how India could do that. And now what you're calling, or tentatively calling, not quite calling, the West Asian Quad in this column, which is the UAE, US, India, and Israel, the foreign ministers meeting right now during Foreign Minister Jaishankar's visit. So one of the things, the danger perhaps, my first question is that as with the Quad, like you say, that as with the Quad, the primary focus shouldn't be military. I mean, strategic, not in terms of military alliance, but there's a lot of economic cooperation to be had, emerging sectors, semiconductors, computers, there's a whole space technology, there's a whole host of traditional and non-traditional areas where these four countries could be cooperating, as in the Quad. On the other hand, the question, what happened with the Quad and what continues to happen is that it is being seen as a strategic grouping, just especially by China and Russia, especially in the way at least global times that, China, the Beijing mouthpieces react. Do you think there is a danger of that going forward, that it perhaps because of this kind of perception, it may even end up limiting our options vis-a-vis however the relationships unfold in the Middle East, which is a notoriously volatile area of the world?
No, my sense is, look, I think, China is going to look at whatever India does now with the US from a hostile perspective. The Russians too are in that position. But they do things themselves. So it is not that we have to accept or debate on the terms set by the Chinese. But what is important for India is, look, if you work with the US, Israel, and United Arab Emirates in the Middle East, what does the region think? For example, in the region, I think what has changed, I think that's where the Abrahamic Accords were really about the expanding cooperation between Israel and its Arab neighbors. See, that is the structural change that has taken place in the region. If you go back to the 70s, Egypt and Israel normalized relations way back in the 70s. But that didn't really lead to reconciliation in a serious sense. But today, the economic cooperation, the kind of activism that is going on between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, it's quite impressive. On the other hand, what we've seen in the Eastern Mediterranean is that Egypt and Israel are cooperating in the development of regional gas pipelines, and they're working together against other perceived adversaries like Turkey. So I think the problem has been the way we've defined our discourse, that it is really the only two issues in the Middle East. One is the Western imperialism versus the Middle East. Other is between the Arabs and the Israelis. But the real world was always far more complicated. And I think what we've seen happen in India is that we're finally becoming less ideological and more pragmatic. After all, China engages, China sells arms to the region, and other people deal with the consequences. For example, China sold long-range missiles to Saudi Arabia, even before it had diplomatic relations. I'm talking about late 1980s. So I think there is a declared one. There is a practical way Middle East works. So I think for India, it was important to unshackle ourselves from the ideological shibboleths, if you will, which is what we did. For example, India was one of the first countries under Nehru to recognize Israel, but it wouldn't establish full diplomatic relations. And in the 60s and 70s, we really cut off what relationship we had with them. So in 91, when Narasimha Rao, consulted everyone, and by 92, we actually established diplomatic relations. So that was a big breakthrough from a political, ideological hostility to a more pragmatic engagement. Today, I think we're seeing the next level, where it's not just about bilateral relations between India and Israel, but but we're actually working together with other countries in the Middle East. That is trilateral, quadrilateral, plurilateral. So this is a new element which is happening. You recall my earlier article, and I thought, there was something there: India, Israel, and Emirates working together. But what has been surprising in the last 2 days was the news that the US is going to form some kind of a quad with these three countries. So this is certainly new. I mean, I think even within the newer situation that we have, so that was a bit surprise. And there, I think they're making it quite clear the initial focus will be on non-military issues. There is, after all, bilateral military cooperation between India and Israel. Everybody knows it. It's not a secret. UAE wants to do more defense cooperation with India. In fact, they were willing to support weapons production in India. So I think the world it's not in shades of gray and or white, but it's a lot of it is gray. So there is a new situation, and this is, can we work with other partners in a collective, in a group? That is the new thing. My sense is this could be the beginning, and tomorrow we could have a separate minilateral, say India, Israel, and Egypt, or India, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. So the multiple possibilities open up in this part of the world. So I think we're really onto something new here in Indian foreign policy.
So, well, everyone should read actually the earlier piece as well, which is on the Indian Express website, linked with this article, which is also, of course, on indianexpress.com, and probably in the description where you're seeing this video. So the second question, taking off from what you just said, an interesting point you make in the piece is that how actually Biden is, in one sense, on major foreign policy issues, continuing some of the sort of maverick things, or what was seen as maverick or going against the grain by Donald Trump. On China, for example, he's maintained the hard position of the US in the Indo-Pacific. And now in West Asia, sort of sticking to the retreat, much more mellow, propagating for a two-state solution, not doing that kind of extreme Jerusalem must be the capital. We don't recognize Palestine practically. But at the same time, this sort of strategic or somewhat of a retreating US, that impression, how do you think that plays into how India should be in the region, perhaps even in the Indo-Pacific? How do you think the US sees India, and how India should take advantage of this situation, or how India should position itself now going forward?
Because, as everywhere, I think we really believe that, look, the US domination is here forever. The US is interested in oil. Therefore, US is going to control the region. That's been the story of the Middle East. I mean, I think everyone believed in that. And that certainly said from the 1970s, because if you go back before the 70s, the US role was quite limited. In fact, President Eisenhower in the Suez Crisis actually intervened against France and Britain in favor of Egypt. So there was a world before American dominance in the Middle East, but the American dominance of the Middle East was really a post-70s phenomenon. And we all assume that is a permanent condition. Now, I think after the Iraq war, after the Afghan debacle, the US is saying, look, they're really wasting too much blood and treasure in the Middle East for limited gains. And that there are other priorities, China, Indo-Pacific, they need to move. So therefore, they need to scale down some of the commitments in the region. They're not going to leave completely, but it's a thought that occurred first under the Obama administration. We saw that in the Trump administration, and now under the Biden administration. So they want to, after the two, extraordinarily expensive conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, there is a sense of more a practical, pragmatic approach to the situation. So I think you're already seeing other powers have moved in. For example, who is intervening in Syria today? It is Russia. That who is intervening in Yemen? It is Iran and Saudi Arabia. So it is other countries are filling the vacuum. But India has largely stayed out of any political or military activism in the region, and it's also been reluctant to work with the United States. So that's what seems to be changing now. That look, this is not that all now regional powers are going to take more responsibility for the situation there. The American nanny is not going to be there forever, doing the heavy lifting and then get criticized for it. So for the regional actors, will do more. That trend is evident. And I think India will join that trend because it stakes are high. That in the past, you could say, look, Americans are taking care of the sea lines, Americans are taking care of the oil supplies. So you don't have to do very much. But today, you need to work with regional partners. You also need to work with the Americans. If the French work with you, sometimes they might work with the Russians. So I think you need to today redefine of our way of thinking about the Middle East. And that, like we saw in Afghanistan, Americans did pull out because we took it for granted. Americans are going to be there forever. Similarly, in the Middle East. So I think now we need to prepare for a situation where the US is not going to be the only power there. Chinese are moving in. The Russians are very active. The Europeans are going to play a larger role. So I think we need to recalibrate our positions in the region to be able to work with local partners as well as with the major powers.
Final questions. In fact, someone else had asked me to ask you this. I must give them anonymous credit. But there is the question on a larger question, which even emanates in this piece, is that like we have this pragmatic diplomacy now, which this is part of. No longer, like you said, we're not thinking in those binaries. And in some senses, perhaps we can trace that to Mohan Singh opening up with the nuclear deal approaching the US. There is, amongst a lot of lay readers, I think nowadays we get a sense that, even from our letters to the editor that we get sometimes, is that with that relationship with the US going closer, calling Mr. Bush a great friend back then when he wasn't that popular in certain circles, we got a very, very concrete, tangible results, which you could show to the Indian people as well. Things like the nuclear deal itself, allowing reactors. What is the kind of, now, like you're saying, things like space exploration, semiconductors, there are real things, there's new energy, new technology areas in which Delhi needs certain gains to show for its domestic economy and polity. What are the kinds of things, say, both with this West Asian Quad and in more general in the kind of new multilateral groupings that we're going into, what are those kinds of internal deliverables? You can't do that, of course, at an official level, that we should be looking at as a country, and our foreign policy establishment should be in a long term or a medium term looking for.
No, you're absolutely right. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was absolutely, understood the importance of the US. He was very practical. That's why he negotiated the nuclear deal. But as we know, he found it hard to implement it because his own party was not in favor. In fact, as we now know, that Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, Congress president, actually put an end to it. And in fact, we kind of paused the whole thing. It's only when Mr. Manmohan Singh in 2008 said, look, if you don't let this go, I'll resign, that he was allowed to go further. Even then, we couldn't complete the deal. That there was only one part of it was completed under Manmohan Singh. And you remember the kind of pressure Sonia Gandhi was under, that actually the UPA coalition had the Communist parties in it. And they said, look, the US over our dead bodies. They tried to pull down the government. Manmohan Singh had to go to a no confidence motion, and the pressure not to do anything with the US was so strong within the ruling coalition, and that kind of constrained Manmohan Singh significantly. Similarly, on Israel, when Pranab Mukherjee, then the defense minister, went to Israel, wanted to build relationship, CPM went ballistic, saying, "Look, how can you do anything with Israel?" Though, of course, Jyoti Basu, as the chief minister, West Bengal did go to, to Israel. That is a different story. But the fact was, the left was so ideologically opposed to doing anything with the Americans, anything with Israel, and they said, "Look, we should just stick with the Chinese and the Russians." So Manmohan Singh tried to break out of it, but he could not do it fully, given the circumstances. And then CPM walked out of the coalition. In the second term, much of the opposition came from within the Congress party itself. So I think despite his good intentions, Manmohan Singh faced huge obstacles in the Congress party. First term, it was mostly CPM, which led to pressures from Sonia Gandhi. In the second term, the Congress itself said, "Look, no, we shouldn't go too far with the United States." It's really Modi, and I think once he came, he untangled a lot of that, completing the nuclear deal, expanding the defense cooperation. And then we saw a whole lot of technologies open up from the United States, changing India's status under the US export control laws. So I think it's been a fairly rapid evolution in the last 7 years. And I think there's no question, if you want to be accurate, Manmohan Singh laid the foundations and Narendra Modi built on that foundations. And that he had, of course, stronger majority. He was unchallenged leader in his own party. So it made it easier for him to do things with the US. And I think there is no question that since then, we are now members of all the major technology export control groups. We get more access to American technology. Many of the restrictions have been lifted. So we think of the nuclear just as some kind of a symbolic thing, but it's really the industry level that your access has gone up significantly. Second, I think on the security side, I think we have much greater access for American weapon systems, and we buy a lot more from them. And in the pandemic, you saw that today, one of the understandings of the Quad meeting was that the US would fund production in Hyderabad by Biological E of a vaccine that we can distribute it in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think I think people have taken too much of it for granted today. That it needed to go through that very wrenching, very difficult process, a political process, which came to one government actually having to go through a confidence motion in the parliament. But today, I think the relationship is sounder than ever before. And new avenues are opening up. For example, on space cooperation, for example, on artificial intelligence. Today, there is far greater receptivity in the US and in India and in Bangalore to say, look, we can work together with the Americans. There's greater trust. All that took about 20 years to build. And I think that is a fact. That doesn't mean, see, this was the problem. That doesn't mean India's independent foreign policy has come to an end. India is, finished, and which was arguments. If you see what CPM argued in 2004, 5, 6, 7. Oh, India's finished. Now you have become a vassal of the United States. But as we saw, it is US that has declined. India's relative weight has gone up. So our leverages have gone up. We are a large country today. We are always a large country. But today, we are the third largest economy. So it's not as if you work with the Americans, you have to cede your sovereignty. And there, I think we have enough to learn from the Chinese, who really took enormous benefits. In fact, we're nowhere near that, not on the weapon side, not on the technology side, but of drawing American investment for transforming the nature of the Chinese economy in terms of production, in terms of research collaborations, universities. And that's how China grew. Because today they're fighting. That's a different story. But I think that our hesitations, our too much of ideology, I think, limited our international possibilities because we had a lot more access to the West. Our elite's children, they all study in the West. Our elite writes books in English. That's not the situation with the Chinese. So I think, but this duality in the Indian elite, on the one hand, deeply connected to the West, but on the other, deeply critical of the West. That dilemma and the duality has eased a bit in the recent years. And I think that's what makes it a little more comfortable for India to do things which we thought we'll never do in the past. But I think this is part of our growing up into a more pragmatic, self-confident, self-assured nation. And I'll just give you one example. Mao Zedong, 1950 to 53, he fought the Americans. Thousands of Chinese died in the Korean War. Mao Zedong's own son died in that war. But 18 years later, or 10 years later, almost 15 years later, he was already negotiating with the Americans. By 71, he had a deal with the Americans because he had a bigger problem with the Russians. But that is statecraft. I mean, there's nothing personal here. And not is that depending on your circumstances you find yourself in, that you try to secure your interests. And I think that brings me to the second question. Look, how we think about liberalism, political principles in domestic politics is very different from international politics. That is, there you are in an anarchic world. Everybody's on their own. This idea that you can build transnational solidarity, I mean, it's a great notion, but in real politics, it doesn't happen. And in the real world, there are multiple sovereign actors. So each one you have to take care of yourself. And I think there we conflate liberalism domestically. And we think you can simply extend it to the to the external world. It doesn't work. There, you have to be pragmatic. You have to be careful. You have to be cautious. You can't make mistakes. Or like you make a mistake on China border, you're still paying for it. 70 years down the road, I mean, you still have a problem. Kashmir, I mean, you still have a problem there because of the assessments that we made of the nature of the international system. So unlike in domestic politics, where there is a Supreme Court, there is a structure that can overturn mistakes. In international politics, making wrong judgments has huge costs. And that's why you have to be, in a sense, calculating in a way that you're not in the domestic politics.
Great, sir. Thanks so much. Everyone should read the piece. It has a lot more in it. We often go on tangents on my questions. So have a look at the piece. It's on the IndianExpress.com. Thank you so much, sir. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Akash.